On the surface, Dr. Rajesh Malhotra and his wife Meera embodied the immigrant dream. To friends, neighbors, and the broader Los Angeles Indian community, they were the very picture of success. Rajesh was a respected physician in his early 40s, known for his private clinic on the outskirts of downtown. With neatly parted hair, a warm, professional smile, and impeccable bedside manners, he had earned a reputation as a man who cared deeply for his patients. To immigrant families navigating the American health system, he was more than just a doctor. He was a lifeline. Meera, a decade younger, was striking in her grace. Soft-spoken, elegant, and deeply devoted to her husband, she seemed the perfect partner to a man of Rajesh's stature. At community events, the two were inseparable. While Rajesh spoke about health awareness and philanthropy, Meera lingered nearby, offering smiles and polite conversation, her eyes glowing with pride. Together, they were adored. Invitations to their dinner parties were highly sought after. Their home, a spacious suburban house with manicured lawns and modern furnishings, was always filled with laughter, food, and music. Guests left praising Meera's cooking and Rajesh's charm. To those who saw them from the outside, it was hard not to feel a twinge of envy. But the story of Rajesh and Meera's marriage began long before their American success. Rajesh had grown up in New Delhi, the eldest son of a modest middle-class family. Brilliant in academics, he had set his sights on medicine early. Those who knew him as a young man described him as driven, ambitious, sometimes to the point of arrogance. He wanted more than stability. He wanted wealth, influence, and recognition. Meera came from a different world. Raised in Jaipur, she was the daughter of a schoolteacher. Practical, intelligent, and warm-hearted, she was less concerned with ambition than with stability. When the two met through a family connection, their union seemed destined. His brilliance and her devotion, his ambition and her loyalty. After marrying in a traditional ceremony, they immigrated to the United States. Rajesh worked tirelessly, building his practice from the ground up, while Meera supported him at every step, handling paperwork, entertaining patients' families, and creating a home that mirrored the success they had dreamed of. By the time Rajesh opened his second clinic, the Malhotras were pillars of their community. Newspapers occasionally featured his medical work. Community groups invited him as a guest speaker. At fundraisers, he was the man who donated generously. Meera, though quieter, was admired as the graceful wife who embodied the virtues of loyalty and sacrifice. But beneath the surface, small cracks were beginning to show. Friends occasionally noticed that Meera seemed distant, her smile sometimes forced. Rajesh, though charming in public, carried an edge of impatience when no one was watching. At home, he often dismissed her opinions, brushing aside her concerns with a curt word or a cold stare. Still, Meera endured. To her, marriage meant loyalty, through good times and bad. She told herself that Rajesh's moods were a symptom of his stress, the price of his endless work. She trusted that the man she had married was still the man she believed him to be. And to the world, their image remained spotless. They were the couple others admired at weddings, the couple whose story was told to new immigrants as proof that hard work and love could build a life of prosperity abroad. But appearances are deceiving. What no one could see was that Rajesh's ambition had taken him down a path darker than anyone could imagine. And Meera, devoted, trusting Meera, was about to discover the truth. The perfect couple was living a lie. By day, Dr. Rajesh Malhotra was everything a physician should be, confident, attentive, and seemingly devoted to his patients. His clinic's waiting room was often filled with immigrant families who trusted him not only for medical advice, but also for guidance as they built new lives in America. He spoke Hindi, Punjabi, and English with ease, offering comfort to those who felt alienated in the U.S. healthcare system. But at night, the walls of that same clinic told a different story. Behind locked doors, Rajesh's practice was no longer a sanctuary of healing. It was a cover for something far darker, a sex trafficking operation that preyed on the most vulnerable women. The scheme had started small. Years earlier, Rajesh had been introduced to men operating in the shadows of Los Angeles, recruiters who promised young immigrant women jobs, visas, or financial help. Many of these women were undocumented, desperate, and afraid to go to authorities. Rajesh realized he could provide more than medical care. He could provide legitimacy. At first, he forged medical records, pregnancy tests, health clearances, and vaccination documents used to push women through immigration or labor loopholes. Soon, those documents became part of a larger web. He began referring women under the guise of employment opportunities to associates who controlled brothels hidden in plain sight. The doctor's office became a hub. Women would arrive seeking care, some genuinely ill, others coerced into visiting. Instead of treatment, they were examined, photographed, and processed like merchandise. Rajesh, with clinical precision, determined whether they were fit for work. Those deemed unsuitable were discarded. Those deemed healthy were funneled into the network. Money flowed steadily. For every woman he cleared, Rajesh received a cut. His medical credentials shielded him from suspicion. After all, who would suspect a respected physician of such crimes? By the time his second clinic opened, Rajesh was no longer just complicit, he was central. He handled transport logistics, created false prescriptions, and kept meticulous records hidden under layers of encrypted files. The money poured in cash deposits, offshore transfers, luxury watches, and fast cars. To his neighbors, his sudden wealth was simply the fruit of success. To Meera, it was harder to explain. She questioned why their accounts ballooned beyond what his clinic could reasonably earn. Rajesh deflected, claiming investments, bonuses, and private consultations for wealthy patients. His charm and authority made it hard to argue. Yet Rajesh's secret weighed on him in other ways. He became more controlling at home, demanding silence when he worked late, locking his office doors, snapping at Meera for minor questions. The more his empire grew, the more paranoid he became. He warned his associates constantly about betrayal. He paid off officials, and most of all, he tightened his grip on Meera, sensing that suspicion, even within his home, could ruin everything. Still, cracks formed. In the shadows of Lowe's angels, women began to talk. Some escaped the trafficking ring and whispered to community shelters about a doctor who examined them before they were forced into sex work. Police heard rumors but lacked evidence. Rajesh's reputation made him untouchable. He knew this, and it emboldened him further. At community events, he smiled for photos, shook hands with city leaders, donated to charities. Behind the curtain, he signed off on fake health clearances and pocketed stacks of untraceable cash. For Rajesh, the double life was thrilling. By day, he was a savior. By night, he was a kingpin. He believed himself untouchable, too intelligent to be caught, too respected to be doubted. But every secret empire has its weakness. Rajesh was his wife. Meera had always trusted him, but trust has limits. The receipts, the whispers, the locked doors, pieces of a puzzle began to form. She had married a healer. Now she was starting to suspect she lived with a criminal. And soon, her suspicion would turn into certainty. For years, Meera had believed in the image she and Rajesh presented to the world, the hardworking doctor and his devoted wife living the immigrant dream. She had played her role perfectly, supporting his long hours, hosting dinner parties, and keeping their home pristine. But lately, cracks in the facade were impossible to ignore. It began with the money. Meera had always managed their household budget. Groceries, utilities, mortgage payments. She knew exactly how much Rajesh earned and how much they spent. But suddenly unexplained deposits began appearing in their joint account. 10,000 here, 20,000 there. When she asked Rajesh about it, his answers were vague. Consultations with private clients, he'd say, or a bonus for a medical study. His tone left no room for further questions, but the unease gnawed at her. Then came the receipts. One evening, while tidying Rajesh's home office, Meera found an envelope tucked beneath his papers. Inside were bills for hotels across the city, luxury suites, some booked for weeks at a time. The names on the reservations weren't his, but his credit card was attached to each payment. When she confronted him, his face hardened. "Those are for patients," he snapped. "Some of them fly in from other states. I arrange their accommodations. Don't pry into things you don't understand." It was the coldness in his voice that unsettled her more than the explanation itself. Soon after, she noticed other irregularities. Rajesh spent long nights at the clinic, locking his study whenever he brought files home. Phone calls came at odd hours, often in hushed tones that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. Once, when she tried to peek into his briefcase, he caught her and slammed it shut so forcefully that she flinched. Meera's unease grew into suspicion. At dinner parties, she began to listen more carefully to community whispers. A family friend casually mentioned hearing about a doctor in Los Angeles whose name had surfaced in troubling stories from women's shelters. Another hinted at shady dealings linked to forged medical documents. Nobody said Rajesh's name aloud, but Meera felt a cold shiver run down her spine each time. Her sleep grew restless. She replayed conversations in her head, his dismissive tone, his sudden flashes of temper, the money he refused to explain. She had married a man of ambition, but what if that ambition had carried him somewhere dangerous? Finally, unable to bear the weight of silence, she confided in her closest friend, Anita. They met in a quiet cafe on a rainy afternoon. Anita listened carefully as Meera laid out her fears: the money, the hotels, the locked office, the whispers in the community. Anita leaned forward, her voice low. "Meera, you need to be careful. If even part of what you're saying is true, this is serious. Rajesh isn't just hiding something from you. He could be involved in something criminal." Meera's heart pounded as the words sank in. She wanted to deny it, to cling to the image of her husband as the man she had trusted, but her instincts told her Anita was right. That night, as she lay beside Rajesh, she studied his face in the dim light. To the world, he was a respected doctor. To her, he was still her husband. But who was he really when the doors were locked, when the phone calls came at midnight, when the money appeared from nowhere? The man she thought she knew was slipping away, replaced by someone she barely recognized. And the more she tried to ignore it, the more the truth pressed down on her. Meera's suspicion had become certainty. Rajesh was hiding a double life. And soon, she would discover just how dark that life truly was. For weeks, Meera carried the weight of her suspicions in silence. She went through the motions of daily life, cooking, cleaning, smiling at community events. Yet inside, the questions clawed at her. Every late-night phone call, every unexplained deposit, every locked drawer gnawed at her sense of security. The tipping point came one evening in early spring. Rajesh had left abruptly after dinner, muttering something about a patient emergency. Meera watched from the living room window as he sped away in his black Mercedes, his phone pressed tightly against his ear. Something in his hurried departure felt off, not the urgency of a doctor saving a life, but the panic of a man covering his tracks. Left alone, Meera wandered into his study. The room smelled faintly of cologne and printer ink, the heavy oak desk littered with files he hadn't bothered to tidy. She hesitated, her heart pounding, before trying the top drawer. Locked, as always. But that night, determination overpowered fear. She remembered seeing Rajesh carelessly toss his keys onto the kitchen counter before leaving. With trembling hands, she retrieved them and returned to the study. It took several tries, but one key finally clicked. The drawer slid open. Inside, neat stacks of documents filled the space: passports, medical certificates, immigration papers. At first glance, they looked legitimate, but the names and photos didn't match. Some passports bore the same face under different names. Others showed women she didn't recognize, their expressions blank and haunting. Beneath the paperwork was a folder marked in bold: "Clients." Meera opened it. Her breath caught in her throat. It wasn't medical information at all, but a ledger, a meticulous list of names, dates, payments, and coded notes. On the margins were references like cleared, unfit, and moved. Alongside were shocking sums of money, far exceeding any medical fee. Meera's hands shook as she turned the pages. The reality slammed into her like ice. Rajesh wasn't simply bending the rules for extra income. He was trafficking women. At the bottom of the drawer, she found a small locked box. Her hands trembled as she used another key from the chain. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Women of varying ages, some barely adults, their eyes hollow, their faces captured in clinical poses. Some wore bruises, others forced smiles. Meera's stomach churned. She dropped the photographs back into the box and shoved it shut, her hands clammy and her heartbeat deafening. There was no denying it anymore. Her husband, the man she had trusted with her life, was running a criminal empire under the guise of healing. That night, Meera barely slept. She sat awake in the darkened living room, the documents still seared into her mind. Her first instinct was fear, for herself, for what Rajesh might do if he discovered she knew. But soon fear gave way to something stronger: anger. Anger at the betrayal. Anger at the lies. Anger at the innocent lives destroyed, while Rajesh lived as a respected man of the community. By dawn, her course was set. She couldn't keep his secret any longer. The next morning, she returned the keys and carefully closed the drawer, leaving everything as she had found it. But inside her, something had irrevocably changed. Meera no longer looked at Rajesh as her husband. He was a stranger, a predator masquerading as a doctor. And if he thought his secret would remain hidden, he was gravely mistaken. For 2 days after discovering the documents, Meera lived in a haze. Every smile from Rajesh felt like a lie, every word from his mouth a performance. She avoided his gaze at breakfast, her mind replaying the images of the women in those photographs. Each time he touched her arm or asked her a question, she recoiled inwardly, struggling not to reveal the storm brewing inside her. But silence was a weight she could no longer carry. On the third evening, as Rajesh sat in his study reviewing patient files, Meera stood in the doorway. Her hands trembled, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Rajesh," she said quietly, "we need to talk." He looked up, brows knitting in annoyance. "I'm busy, can it wait?" "No," she replied firmly, "it can't." Her tone caught him off guard. Meera had always been gentle, accommodating. Now there was a sharpness in her voice he didn't recognize. Reluctantly, he set his papers aside. "What is it?" he asked, his voice laced with irritation. She hesitated, her heart pounding. Then she said it. "I know what you're doing." Rajesh's face froze. For a long moment the room was silent except for the ticking of the wall clock. His expression hardened, the charm draining from his features. "What exactly do you think you know?" he said slowly, his voice low and dangerous. Meera met his gaze. "The passports, the forged papers, the photographs, the money that doesn't belong to us, I've seen it all." His jaw tightened. He leaned back in his chair, studying her with cold calculation. "You went through my things," he said flatly. "I had to," she shot back, her voice rising. "You've lied to me for years, Rajesh, pretending to be a healer, a respected man, but you're not. You're a criminal, you're trafficking women." Her words hung in the air like shards of glass. For a moment, Rajesh said nothing. Then, to her horror, he smirked. "You think you've uncovered some dark secret? Do you have any idea how the world works, Meera? These women were already desperate, already ruined. I gave them a purpose. I gave them a way to survive." "You exploited them," Meera snapped. "You destroyed lives, and you destroyed mine." Rajesh slammed his fist on the desk, making her flinch. "Enough! You don't understand the sacrifices I've made, the risks I've taken, everything I've built for us, for this family. You would throw it away because of some bleeding heart nonsense." Meera's eyes filled with tears, but her voice remained steady. "This isn't about sacrifice. It's about greed. You didn't build this for us, you built it for yourself, and I won't be silent anymore." Rajesh stood abruptly, his towering frame casting a shadow over her. His eyes, once warm and charming, now burned with fury. "Be very careful, Meera," he hissed. "You don't know what you're stepping into. If you speak a word of this to anyone, you won't just ruin me, you'll ruin yourself. Do you think the police will believe the obedient wife who looked the other way all these years? You'll go down with me." Meera's breath caught. For the first time, she realized the depth of his ruthlessness. This wasn't just about protecting his empire, it was about silencing her. But something inside her had shifted. The fear that once held her captive was now eclipsed by determination. She straightened her spine and met his glare. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," she whispered. Rajesh's jaw clenched. For a split second, she thought he might strike her. Instead, he turned sharply, grabbing his coat from the chair. "This conversation never happened," he growled, storming out of the room. The door slammed behind him, leaving Meera trembling in the silence. She knew now that she was in danger. The man she had once loved was gone, replaced by a predator who would stop at nothing to protect his secret. And if she wanted justice, for herself and for the women whose faces haunted her, she would have to fight for it. After the confrontation, Meera knew she couldn't stay silent. Rajesh's warning echoed in her ears, his words laced with venom. "You'll go down with me." It wasn't just a threat, it was a promise. That night she barely slept. Every creak of the house made her flinch. She imagined Rajesh watching her, waiting for the right moment to silence her forever. She realized that her life, like the lives of those women in his photographs, was now in danger. Meera needed a plan. The next morning, while Rajesh was at the clinic, she moved quickly. She retrieved her phone and began photographing everything she had found in his locked drawer: the forged passports, the ledger, the photographs. She sent the images to a hidden email account she had just created under a false name. If Rajesh discovered her phone, at least the evidence would be safe elsewhere. Then she began gathering her own escape kit. From her jewelry box, she slipped out a few gold bangles and a necklace, items she could sell quickly if she needed money. She stuffed a change of clothes into a tote bag and hid it behind the cleaning supplies in the laundry room. Every detail mattered. Every move had to be invisible. But the hardest part was deciding who to trust. Her first instinct was Anita. Her friend had always been loyal, but involving her meant putting her in danger. Instead, Meera decided to take a quieter path. She began researching women's shelters in Los Angeles, memorizing the addresses in case she had to flee without warning. She also called a distant cousin back in India under the pretense of catching up, carefully slipping in questions about whether she could stay if she ever visited. She didn't say why, but her cousin's warm response gave her a sliver of comfort. The final piece of her plan was the riskiest: contacting law enforcement. One afternoon, under the guise of grocery shopping, Meera walked into a payphone booth near a bus stop. With trembling fingers, she dialed a local tip line she had found online. When the operator answered, Meera disguised her voice as best she could. "There's a doctor in Los Angeles," she whispered. "He's running something illegal. He's trafficking women." She gave Rajesh's clinic address before hanging up abruptly, her heart racing. It wasn't enough to bring him down, not yet, but it was a start. Someone out there now knew. That evening when Rajesh returned home, he was unusually calm. Too calm. He kissed her cheek, asked about dinner, and laughed at the evening news. But his eyes lingered on her in a way that made her skin crawl, cold, suspicious, calculating. Meera forced herself to smile, to act normal. But inside, she repeated her silent mantra: stay ready, stay quiet, stay alive. Her escape plan was in motion. The question was whether she would get out before Rajesh realized how much she truly knew. When Meera made the anonymous call, she hadn't expected an immediate response. She imagined her tip being lost in a pile of dead leads, forgotten as quickly as it was spoken. But within days, quiet ripples began to spread. Unbeknownst to Rajesh, law enforcement had already received fragments of similar reports from shelters and advocacy groups. Women whispered about a doctor who examined them before they were forced into brothels, but none could provide concrete proof. Meera's tip, paired with the clinic's address, was the missing puzzle piece investigators had been waiting for. A task force specializing in human trafficking began discreet surveillance. Detectives noted the unusual stream of young women entering Rajesh's clinic late at night. They watched his associates, men who loitered nearby, escorting women in and out, always in silence, always with cash. On paper, Rajesh's clinic operated legitimately. But on the streets, whispers painted a darker picture. Meanwhile, at home, Meera lived in a state of constant dread. Rajesh's behavior had shifted since their confrontation. He was quieter, more watchful, his every glance tinged with suspicion. He began checking her phone, questioning her errands, monitoring her movements. Meera learned to hide her fear behind a mask of obedience. But small acts of defiance gave her strength. She continued to document everything, every late-night call, every unexplained bank deposit, every face she glimpsed entering the clinic. Each note, each photograph, was another piece of evidence tucked safely away in her secret email account. Then one afternoon, a knock on her door nearly stopped her heart. When she opened it, a woman stood outside, plainclothes, calm, but with an air of authority. She introduced herself quietly as Detective Alvarez. "We need to talk," she said, privately. Meera's breath caught. Somehow they had traced the call back to her. For a moment, panic flooded her. What if Rajesh found out? But Alvarez's steady voice reassured her. "You're not in trouble, we just want to hear your side." They spoke in whispers at the kitchen table, the blinds drawn tight. Meera poured out everything: the documents, the ledger, the photographs, the fear that consumed her daily life. She showed Alvarez the email account where she had stored the evidence. The detective listened carefully, her face grave. "This is enough to move forward," she said at last. "But you need to understand, when we act, your husband will know you've betrayed him, will need to protect you." The words sank heavy in Meera's chest. She wanted justice, but the thought of facing Rajesh's wrath terrified her. Still, she nodded. "I can't stay silent anymore. Too many lives have already been destroyed." From that moment, the investigation accelerated. Undercover officers posed as patients at Rajesh's clinic, gathering proof of illegal medical clearances. Financial analysts traced his accounts, uncovering large sums laundered through shell companies. Slowly, the mask of respectability began to crack. But Rajesh was not a man easily fooled. He sensed the shift, the lingering cars parked near his office, the sudden scrutiny from banks, the tense whispers in his network. His paranoia grew. At home, his eyes followed Meera constantly. One night, as they sat in silence over dinner, he spoke without looking up. "If anything ever happens to me, Meera, just know, I'll make sure you go down with me." Her spoon froze halfway to her lips. She forced herself to smile, but inside her heart thundered. She knew time was running out. The walls were closing in on Rajesh, and Meera was caught in the middle, between the justice she craved and the danger she feared. The pressure around Rajesh was tightening like a noose. His once seamless empire was beginning to show cracks, clients growing nervous, payments delayed, strange faces loitering near his clinic. He barked at his associates to be cautious, but no matter how carefully he planned, a gnawing paranoia grew inside him. At home, he grew colder. His questions to Meera became interrogations. "Where did you go today? Who were you speaking to? Why did you take so long at the market?" He inspected her phone with alarming frequency, scrolling through her messages and call history, searching for any trace of betrayal. But what unsettled him most was her composure. Meera was no longer timid. She carried herself with quiet strength, answering his questions calmly without flinching. To Rajesh, that calmness was damning. It meant she was hiding something. One evening, Rajesh returned home unexpectedly early. As he walked through the front door, he heard the faint sound of Meera's voice in the kitchen. She was on the phone, her tone urgent but hushed. The moment she saw him, she hung up abruptly. "Who was that?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "Anita," Meera lied smoothly. "We were planning the Diwali gathering." But Rajesh wasn't convinced. He stepped closer, towering over her, his jaw clenched. "If you're lying to me, Meera, you'll regret it." For the first time, she didn't look away. "I'm not the one who should be afraid," she whispered. His hand twitched, and for a terrifying second, Meera thought he might strike her. Instead, he stormed into his study, slamming the door so hard the house rattled. That night, Rajesh called one of his closest enforcers, a man named Vikram. In hushed tones, he laid out his fear. Someone in his own home was leaking information. "If my wife has betrayed me," he said coldly, I need to know, and if she has, I'll deal with her myself. Over the next few days, Rajesh's paranoia turned into surveillance. He instructed Vikram to follow Meera discreetly. Each time she left the house, to shop, to visit the temple, to walk in the park, he demanded a report. But Meera, sensing danger, was careful. She kept her movements simple, predictable, giving Rajesh nothing tangible to hold against her. Still, his suspicion festered. One night, unable to contain his rage, he confronted her again. "You've been talking to someone?" he accused, his voice low and venomous. "Police, journalists, don't think I don't notice." Meera stood her ground. "I've been talking to myself," she said evenly, "trying to figure out who my husband really is." Her defiance infuriated him. Rajesh grabbed her wrist, squeezing until she winced. "You think you can outsmart me? I've destroyed people for less." His eyes blazed with fury. "If you betray me, Meera, I'll make sure you disappear, just like them." She yanked her wrist free, her voice trembling but resolute. "Then at least I won't disappear in silence." For a moment, Rajesh simply stared at her, stunned by her boldness. Then he turned away abruptly, muttering under his breath. That night, Meera slept with her tote bag hidden beneath the bed, her heart pounding with every sound outside the window. She knew Rajesh was growing desperate, and desperation made him dangerous. What she didn't know was that the investigation was already closing in. Detectives had secured a warrant. Surveillance, footage, and financial records were piling up. Rajesh's empire was crumbling. But Rajesh, blinded by paranoia, saw only one obstacle in his way: Meera. And if he couldn't control her, he would destroy her. For weeks, detectives had built their case brick by brick. Surveillance cameras captured the stream of young women entering Rajesh's clinic at odd hours. Undercover officers posed as clients, recording his offers to arrange documents for cash. Bank records revealed hundreds of thousands of dollars funneled through shell companies. It was enough. On a cool Friday evening, a task force assembled outside the Malhotra residence. They moved with quiet precision, bulletproof vests strapped tight, radios whispering updates, eyes locked on the house where the respected doctor sat unaware of what was about to unfold. Inside, Rajesh was in his study, nursing a glass of whiskey while scrolling through encrypted files on his laptop. The tension in his face was unmistakable. He had sensed for days that something was closing in around him. His associates had gone silent. Clients were pulling away. Something was wrong, and he knew it. Meera sat in the living room, pretending to watch television. Her tote bag was still hidden nearby, her body tense with anticipation. She didn't know exactly when, but she felt in her bones that Rajesh's empire was about to collapse. The knock at the door was sharp, commanding. "Dr. Rajesh Malhotra, open up, police." Rajesh froze, his glass slipping from his hand and shattering on the floor. For a split second, he considered running. Then the door burst open, and heavily armed officers poured in. "Hands where we can see them." Rajesh's face twisted in fury. "This is a mistake. I'm a doctor," he shouted, but his protests were drowned out by the chaos. Officers pinned him against the wall, cuffing his wrists as he spat curses and threats. Meera stood motionless, her heart pounding. She met the eyes of Detective Alvarez, who gave her a brief nod, silent reassurance that she was safe now. Rajesh, however, was anything but calm. As officers dragged him toward the door, he craned his neck to glare at Meera. His voice was venomous. "You did this to me. You'll pay for this, Meera. Do you hear me?" But his words were swallowed by the flashing red and blue lights outside. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, whispering in shock as the once respected doctor was shoved into the back of a police car. The man they had admired, invited into their homes, trusted with their health, exposed for what he truly was. As the sirens faded into the night, Meera collapsed onto the sofa, tears streaming down her face. For the first time in years, she felt the weight lifting. Fear still lingered, Rajesh's threats echoed in her mind, but alongside it was something new. Relief. The man who had built an empire of lies was finally behind bars. And though the fight for justice was far from over, Meera knew she had taken the first step toward reclaiming her life. Rajesh's arrest sent shockwaves through the community. Newspapers splashed his face across front pages. Respected doctor exposed in human trafficking ring. His patients were stunned, his colleagues horrified. The man who once healed now stood accused of destroying lives. The trial began months later, inside a packed courtroom buzzing with reporters. Rajesh arrived each day in an expensive suit, his arrogance intact. He smirked at cameras, whispered threats to his lawyers, and glared at Meera whenever their eyes met. The prosecution presented damning evidence. Undercover recordings showed Rajesh negotiating deals for fake visas. Bank statements traced his wealth to illegal schemes. Survivors testified with trembling voices, describing how they were trapped, blackmailed, and exploited. Each story chipped away at the illusion Rajesh had built. When Meera was called to the stand, the courtroom fell silent. She walked with measured steps, her head held high despite the tremor in her hands. For years she had lived in shadows, silenced by fear. Now under oath she spoke her truth. "He wasn't the man people thought he was," she said steadily. Behind closed doors, Rajesh was cruel, manipulative, and dangerous. He treated people, his own wife included, as property. I stayed silent because I was scared, but silence only gave him more power. Rajesh's face darkened, his jaw clenched as she testified. His lawyer objected, claiming her words were personal attacks, but the judge allowed her to continue. And with each word, Meera felt her fear loosening its grip. After weeks of testimony, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all major counts: human trafficking, fraud, assault, and conspiracy. The judge's voice rang out clearly as Rajesh was sentenced to life in prison without parole. He erupted in fury, shouting that it was a setup, that his enemies had framed him. But no one believed him anymore. His empire was gone, his power stripped away. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed Meera. She gave a short statement, her voice steady despite the flashing cameras. "Justice has been served," she said. "This is not just about me. It's about every woman who has ever been silenced. I hope this case reminds others that even the most powerful men can fall." With Rajesh behind bars, Meera slowly began to rebuild her life. The fear didn't vanish overnight. His threats still haunted her dreams, but there was space now for healing. She reconnected with her family, resumed her studies, and began volunteering at a local shelter for women. In the quiet moments, she sometimes wondered how she had survived it all. But then she remembered her mother's words: "Courage isn't the absence of fear, it's choosing to act in spite of it." Rajesh's story ended in chains. Meera's, however, was just beginning. She was no longer the silent wife trapped in a gilded cage. She was a survivor, and for the first time in years, she was free.